Good morning and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm your host, I'm actually your host, Chris Whitehead, and today we are talking about water, an issue that I don't talk about enough, frankly. My background is air quality and climate risk and environmental justice, but I've always been really, really interested in water topics and find them coming up more and more as climate change impacts continue to mount. So I've been trying to do as much homework as I can, frankly, and talk to people a lot smarter than myself on these topics and learn as much as I possibly can and hopefully help extend that information out to you guys. Unfortunately, it's a complicated issue. Water problems are obviously historical, still cleaning up from past contamination. We've only had environmental regulations now for roughly 50 years. And what's changed in that time has been dramatic. But then there's also current challenges that we also have to mount and have to try to actually take on objectively. The a couple of experts I invited here today address water quality issues as objectively and also creatively as I'd say they possibly can, and both understand the importance of the topic as it ties to public health and economic development as well. And both are obviously always going to be intertwined. And I'm just going to stall for a second until Pete gets back, and this is why we have editing. Beautiful. So with that, I'm going to say I'm excited today to be speaking with Pete Malinowski, the executive director of the Billion Oyster Project, and Mark McDonough, president of New Jersey American Water. Guys, if you both come on video and sound, please. Good morning. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Great to be here.
Thanks so
Great.
much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to have you guys. Um, I don't like doing long bios. I obviously stated your positions and all that, but that doesn't really like say the whole story. You guys want to just take a turn talking a little bit about how you decided to get into water topics? Because frankly, you both could be doing almost anything you want to right now.
Go ahead, Mark.
Sure. Happy to describe. So I have an sort of odd path to water. I came to American Water. I'm an attorney by trade, was in private practice, but I have a deep background in federal contracting and American Water. One of the things that American Water does is it's the largest defense contractor in the utilities privatization area with Department of Defense. Currently running 19 installation water and wastewater for 19 installations. So I really came in here to help them with their federal contracting and had no sort of clue the depth and interest of water. So now 20 years in, I'm not sure I could work in any other industry. You know, our former CEO, Susan Story, used to say, water's not a job, it's a calling. And we're the only utility you ingest. So we really have a very intimate impact in people's lives every day as a life-sustaining utility. So um, after years of sort of working on the legal side and compliance side for American Water, I got the opportunity to come over to operations and eventually become president of New Jersey American Water and leading 850 professionals every day when they're delivering a product like this is not something I'll get to. I remind myself in the rough days that I'm not going to get to do this forever, so I should take full advantage of it.
Well, thank you, Mark. And you've been a friend for a while now. And for those who don't know, New Jersey American Water is headquartered in Camden, New Jersey, right in the middle of an overburn community. And they are a company, and I don't work for them, but I'm just going to say this anyway from something I've noticed over the last few years, trying to do it the right way and trying to run a good business and do good outreach. So that's very very, very refreshing, honestly, because it doesn't always happen. So thank you for that. Pete,
Yeah, so I've sort of never been away from water. I grew up on a small oyster farm, a family oyster farm in Fisher's Island, New York, and was very much working on the farm growing up with my siblings and parents and in the water, on the water, under the water. and really valued the educational experience I had on the farm. And I moved to New York after college and wanted to get into teaching. And I ended up finding a public school that was looking for someone to teach oyster farming in New York City, which is pretty rare. And so I started doing that. And then we started growing oysters as a class project back in 2008 or 9. And then that led to the development of the Billion Oyster Project. So I've sort of just been on this water track since forever.
That's awesome. But I also, before we started recording here today, I mentioned to Pete that I had just finished watching his TED Talk on the history and development of the project itself. I definitely recommend everyone listening today to tune into that also. But can you talk quickly, Pete, as to actually what the project is, how it got started, how it's been going, um, things you're m most excited about the project?
Yes, it got started as a way to sort of leverage the learning opportunities created by farming for a an audience that wouldn't normally have that experience. So the idea is to use oyster farming and oyster restoration as a lens to learn about natural systems, about production systems and water quality and all of that. And so we started doing that at Harbor School and then develop Billion Oyster Project as a way to broadcast that to schools all over the city. So we work with about 150 public schools, do curriculum development, teacher training programs, and also have a large scale restoration operation. So we grow oysters on Governor's Island for the purpose of restoring oyster reefs to the harbor. And we try to do all of that in a way that connects people to the harbor. New York Harbor is New York City's biggest and best looking open space and most underutilized open space. And so we want New Yorkers, I mean, we believe that everyone in New York City has a right to access a clean, abundant, and accessible harbor. And that's the best way we can see to make that happen is to get everyone we can involved in restoring what was the dominant habitat type in what once was one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet.
Absolutely. That's definitely a very, very interesting work. And I love um, again, the tie of the biological worlds to public health to just giving people the cultural opportunities that haven't been around for decades, frankly. So I've always been interested by this project. And I think Casey Stahl might have been the first one to tell me about this a few years ago. I worked with him a little bit in offshore wind, and
Yeah.
he said, "Hey, you gotta take a look what this guy is doing. It's interesting work. You like it." And yeah, he was right. So it took us a few years to have this conversation, but I'm happy we are today. And Mark, you come at water quality from a slightly varied perspective, but a lot of commonalities there as well. You have to think about past contaminations, historical stuff in New Jersey, but then basically boils down, bad pun, to giving people the best quality water you can in New Jersey, right?
Yeah, I mean, so New Jersey American Water is the largest regulated water utility in the state. We serve about 2.9 million people. So about one out of every three folks in the state get our water every day. And so we're on a very massive scale trying to deliver water to the tap that is safe, reliable, and affordable. And those are sort of the guideposts for what we do. So that involves, of course, we take water out of the environment, unlike the electric companies that generate, electricity. So how it exists in the environment is very important to us. And we love things like what Pete's doing. Anybody who cares about how the quality of water is in nature is very important to us, source water. But then we have to do quite a bit of work to A, treat the water to ensure that it's consumable and B, deliver it to people through recapitalization. So, and do all that, that takes a massive amount of investment. We spend well over $500 million a year on capital programs, pipe relining, new treatment programs. And then, but we have to make that affordable. for the approximately 700,000 direct customers that we have. And we've managed to do that. We keep our costs, and utility costs is a big issue in New Jersey these days. You may have
Now,
heard about the big issue in New York, pretty much big issue everywhere. But we stay at about 1 to 2% of a median household income, which is really in that affordability range. Academics will tell you that's really the place to be. So we're very proud of that fact. But it's a constant challenge, places like New York City and New Jersey. These are Northeast, very industrial states, and so there's a lot of opportunity for contamination of source water and a continual understanding of things like microplastics and emerging contaminants. So, it's a constant, uh, I won't say struggle, but a constant work to stay ahead of the next thing that could be driving down water quality.
and on that topic, can you talk a little bit as to the testing systems you guys have in place to ensure that the stuff going through the tap is the highest possible quality?
Yeah, so it's I have a great water quality team. We'll conduct well over 80,000 water tests. We do a mix of what we call process tests and regulatory tests or compliance tests. So the State Department of Environmental Protection, in cooperation with the EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act, requires a certain number of tests. And it's interesting, right? We test biology is great and we lean heavily into it, but of course, um, fecal matter and biological material in the water is also a driver and has traditionally been a driver for illness. So we spend a lot of attention to making sure that the water is, that type of material is removed. And then it's the sort of what I'll call third source stuff that gets into water, like forever chemicals and things of that nature. And even the nature of how they used to transport water around with like lead products and corrosion into water. So we test constantly every day, and we have a whole series of tests throughout the year that we have to meet and standards we have to report. I highly encourage. I suspect very few people do it, but they get a consumer confidence report every year from their water company by law. And most people don't look at it. They should absolutely pay attention to what their water company is doing.
Now, I'm going to ask you both a variation of the same question then. Over the last, well, you both have been involved now in water quality in New York and New Jersey for approximately the same amount of time, ballpark. In that time, how has quality of water in each state improved? And actually, Pete, if you want to go first on that one.
That's a sort of a giant question.
It is.
Um, you know, the water quality in New York Harbor has been improving steadily for the last 50 years since passage of the Clean Water Act. In the last 15 years, the improvements in New York Harbor have been incremental. It was in 1986 when the North River wastewater treatment plant was completed. That marked the end of dry weather discharge into the harbor, and that really, resulted in dramatic improvements over time. The biggest issue facing water quality in New York Harbor is combined sewer overflows, which is a unfortunate and solvable problem, but essentially every time it rains, the because the storm drains are connected to the sanitary sewers, the everything overflows into the harbor, and so you end up with untreated household wastewater and everything that's on the street and oil and trash and everything flowing out into the harbor. That problem has been our version of, our New York City water utility, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, has been working steadily to try to reduce those events, but through more porous pavement, green roofs, street planting, rain gardens, and larger storage tanks. But those changes in the last 15 years have been incremental improvements, nothing that dramatic. What's happened in since I've been on the water all the time in New York is that because of that 50 years of improvement, the wildlife in New York City is really coming back in a very dramatic way, and that's been incredible to see. We there's still a lot of work to do to make New York Harbor swimmable and fishable all the time. We really need to address that combined sewer overflow problem. And there are cities like London is a good example that have really tackled that head on and made dramatic improvements. Um, but right now, even now, the harbor is safe to swim. Most of the harbor is safe to swim in most of the time. So if there hasn't been a big rain event 20, in the last 24, 48 hours, the vast majority of the harbor is clean. If it was a beach, it would be open, and that's pretty incredible.
No, absolutely agree. And even just I can remember from my childhood, I was born in 83 and I was told from early on, you can't go in that water. It's not okay. And I think I even heard you say in your TED talk that yeah, at times it just smelled bad. You watch stuff actually floating in it, and just you don't want to think about that type of stuff. But that I think of like I saw online or on Facebook or something the other day. If you see a horse drinking water, you know it's safe to drink. I'm paraphrasing that. But is that tied to biodiversity always a good indication that things are getting better? I, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, it's actually a really interesting example because the lore around New York City finally biting the bullet and building the aqueduct system and bringing water down from upstate New York in the mid 1800s. The lore around that is that everyone was drawing water from wells, and there wasn't enough water for the city. They limited the growth of the city, the access to fresh water. But the other thing that happened is that the Collect Pond, which is now right near, which was where City Hall is now, right near there, got to the point where horses stopped drinking from the Collect Pond because it was so gross. And then that, was one of the motivators for building the incredible aqueduct system that brings fresh water down from upstate now. So horses, but I really appreciate the reference you made, which is the harbor being off-putting and smelling bad and looking bad, and most New Yorkers carry that memory, even if they didn't experience it, because it's so ingrained in the culture of New York City that the harbor is toxic and polluted and dangerous to touch. And the reality is that that's not the case anymore. But if you ask any New Yorker on the street, if they would ever consider swimming in the East River, they'd all say, "No, that's disgusting." You come up with three heads, but
There's something out of The Simpsons, right?
yeah.
And also, Mark, on that topic, we kind of touched on this before, but I if you talk to enough people who've been in the industry for long enough, they'll tell you stories about back in the day. It was just taught the actually the solution to this was this actually dilution, dump it in the water.
Yeah.
And again, up until the 70s, wasn't regulation, but you had decades and decades of
Yeah.
garbage in every possible way going into the system. How has water in New Jersey improved during the time you've been here?
So, and by the way, I have to confess, I'm a child of Northeast Ohio. I swam in the Cuyahoga River in the 70s when it caught on fire.
Oh, there you go.
Used to freak my mother out very much. But I was happy to take my children back to a visit to the homeland and show them Lake Erie and show them the Cuyahoga River, and it's much improved. So, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, Chris. Water quality has definitely improved in New Jersey industrial. The regulations that it came on have a lot of control. The challenge is that we still have a fair amount of that history to deal with in terms of whether we make water suitable to recreate in versus consume. And so with forever chemicals and 1,4-dioxane and things of that nature, we know better now what we have to treat, and particularly companies like New Jersey American. I mean, we've been treating for PFAS since 2012. And then when climate change is now presenting us with a whole series of additional challenges, and of course, traditionally New Jersey is very small. It's a series of very, little town that has its school district and police force and fire department and water company. Well, it's very complicated. It's complicated to run a school district now. It's incredibly complicated to run a water system because while nature and water source tends to be better, there's now more things that are challenging it. So I'll just give you two quick examples of how climate change impacts. One, clouds can hold 40% more water because of the rise in humidity, and they microburst, they rain harder. And when that rain hits the ground, it pushes things. Pete mentioned cross-connected systems. It pushes more stuff out into your source water. And it literally can just be turbidity, just dirt from the side, on the Delaware River. We see much larger fluctuations now in turbidity. And then the second piece uh, of climate change is that, change in temperature, change in humidity causes hazardous algal blooms. And we have now seen multiple years in New Jersey where hazardous algal blooms have erupted on moving water, the Raritan and Millstone River. This is extraordinary. If I had $1 for every one of my senior folks who said, "Oh, I've never seen that in my career," I probably would have retired. But it is a function. So while overall, I'd say New Jersey is much healthier and better, and the nature's rebounding, we have more challenges now. And I won't, we can talk later about America's addiction to plastics and the impact that it has, the incredibly devastating impact it's having on the environment.
Interesting stuff. And I had to actually smile a little bit as you were talking about that, even though it was obviously heavy topics, because I wanted to go into climate change next. So thank you for the segue there.
Sure.
Pete, how is climate change impacting your work?
Um, okay, so one is that the oysters we work with, Chrysostea virginica, the Eastern oyster, American oyster, that species thrives from Labrador to Mexico. So a temperature, so water temperature is they have a very broad range of acceptable water temperature. Because of that, the temperature does not have a big impact on our work. There's a big risk from ocean acidification, which is a correlated impact of too much carbon in the atmosphere,
Yeah.
and that has not begun affecting us yet, but it's something that we're sort of tuned into and trying to learn from the experience of oyster farmers on the west coast of the U.S. because they've been dealing with that in a big way for I guess a couple decades. So we're paying attention to that. The From a resiliency standpoint and a weather standpoint, that is New York City is so vulnerable to rising water levels and more intense storms. And we saw that during Hurricane Sandy, and I've seen it since through all of the major rain events that Mark is referencing. That is not necessarily bad for us because we are in the resiliency business, and New Yorkers being more tuned into the need to protect coastlines and be a little more connected to the water is a good thing for Billion Oyster Project. It's a bad thing for New York City. So it's kind of where we sit. And then as oyster reefs can and should be part of an integrated solution to protecting New York City from rising water levels and more intense storms, and we want to be part of that. And then the last thing I'll say is that from on like the macro level, when we think about the causes of climate change, fundamentally more people need to be willing to accept a little more inconvenience into their lives to take better care of the planet. And that takes a level of, I would say, love and appreciation for the natural world, right? We're not as a species, we're not motivated very well by negative things that could happen in the future. We've seen that, right?
Right.
But so we are very much about connecting people to nature and building that awareness and affinity for the natural world and excitement and the agency that comes with knowing you can have a positive impact on the planet through the work you do in school, decisions you make every day. And I believe that that is our biggest contribution to, the climate change problem is getting hundreds of thousands of people on board and excited about their ability to have an impact.
absolutely love that, and it's something I've been trying to work on a lot over the last couple of years, and things like the event we just had actually at Rutgers talking to young people. But can you both talk a little bit too about the need and the benefits actually of objectively taking action now and spending the dollar now as opposed to potentially waiting and dealing with higher risk of adverse climate impacts. And if you wait, just hypothetically, if a company waits and doesn't act on climate, it could cost them more long run. And that one, I guess Mark, you might be best to answer that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that because it's a two. And by the way, let me say this for Pete, talking to young people, we find getting them excited, it is so crucial because there's this tendency to sort of think they can't impact the world. And young people are open to that idea, and they truly can have a huge impact on the water system. And then as a result, the ecosystem. So, in terms of what we do around dealing with climate variation, climate change, it's a piece of sort of hardening. A good example of that would be Hurricane Ida. We put in at the behest of the Army Corps of Engineer. We spent several tens of millions of dollars to build a flood wall around our Weirton Millstone plant in the central part of the state, and we raised it to 48 feet from about 44. And they said you're good for a 500-year flood. And then what was then Tropical Storm Ida, because it was no longer a hurricane by the time it hit us, came out of the west, very untraditional storm for New Jersey, and it devastated every water system in the central part of the state. We maintained operations. So that's an example of you have to be forward thinking in terms of how you're hardening your assets to the impacts of this. But of course, that's just dealing with the problem in a hardening way as opposed to trying to resolve the problem. So we do a lot because water is very electric intensive. It takes a lot of energy to push and pull and move water. So we're trying to, we have the largest floating solar array at our Canoe Brook plant, Reservoir One in the United States, and it operates about 95 to 99% of the capacity of electricity on the plant on most days. So it's forward thinking like that. You have to act now. This is very real. And I think what people don't quite understand is they see climate change as this massive hurricane or, heat in the very high 100 degrees. It's the small insidious changes that are being caused in the climate. It's the additional humidity. It's the endless sort of oppressive Florida humidity, if you will, in New Jersey for weeks on time. That causes nature to change, right? That causes hazardous algal blooms to come into existence. That causes, the turbidity I talked about and all those types of things. How you operate these plants, you need these constant inputs to understand the little changes in nature that are causing outsized impacts. And it's not the big dramatic hurricane or superstorm or something that happens. Those are bad too, can have a lot of impact. But it's the smaller things that, if the winter gets a bit colder because the climate's on this wild coaster ride, you will break more water mains, you will have more expense, you will impact the water quality. All of that is things we look at, and it has to happen now.
And just as a follow up to that, Mark, being b b being a major executive with a large company and obviously interacting with others and peers, do you think that's an idea that's held widely by your peers and that others understand that all this has to be looked at objectively and understood as potential risks to their company?
Yeah, I think absolutely in the utility industry writ large, but also in the water industry, the other regulated industry leaders absolutely understand the impact of this because they live it. You cannot go in and have a conversation with an operator and not hear a story about this 5 minutes into the conversation or less. The other piece of it is that the vast majority of water systems are municipally owned. They're relatively small. Particularly in New Jersey, there's very little consolidation of these types of operations. So while I think the towns, you know, there's two impacts of that. One, there can be political influence to how people view issues. We look at it very much stone cold. We have to operate as a water purveyor. What is it? What is really impacting our system? I think the other piece is that I often refer to water systems, they're too small to succeed. We always say are too big to fail. They're genuinely too small to succeed. They simply can't do the things they need to do to have the impact to harden their system or recapitalize their pipes. In a storm like Ida, it's one thing to keep the plant going, but if you haven't maintained your mains, they'll burst from the reverse pressure created by the water sitting on top of it. So that's really the challenge. I think most people recognize it, but whether they can do something about it is a whole nother question.
And I guess question to both of you, historically, the infrastructure in this country, just basically across the board, but also including water, has not actually gotten the highest marks. And obviously there are exceptions here, but there's outdated systems, there's still lead pipes, unfortunately. How far behind the eight ball are we? I don't think I phrased that right, but if the maintenance isn't done, if the combined sewer overflows aren't taken out and put something else to put in its place, what exactly are we leaving for ourselves? What's that future going to look like?
Well, I think it comes back a little bit to the to I'm going to take it from what Mark was saying about young people being like developing a level of apathy because uh, and I think that's the most dangerous thing is being apathetic towards your ability to have to build a better future. And I think that's our fault as an environmental movement for spending 50 years trying to scare everyone, starting with the Cuyahoga River burning, right? Starting with all of these very real present human health risks that were obvious, smog in cities and all of that. And but now we've been beating everyone down for so long with these negative stories of a scary future that it's hard to think aspirationally. So on one hand, you could say, what's the big deal? We're pouring raw sewage into the harbor. It's always been dirty. It's always going to be dirty. Big deal. But if we think about a future where there are more street trees in New York City and more green roofs and more porous pavement, and we've solved the combined sewer overflow problem, and the harbor is full of wild animals that are visible and apparent to everyone in New York City, like that is the risk is that we don't do that. We don't have we keep the status quo and we don't work hard to develop a better future that is better for quality of life for New Yorkers. It's better for the demands on the water utilities. It's better for just walking down the street in New York City. And that is, I think, the risk. But you have to be able to dream a little bit. You have to be able to see the current situation and want something better. So I don't know that doesn't really answer your question, but I mean the reality is that there's while there are dangers and risks and bad things coming, we could muddle through, and have and try to address emergencies as they arise and stick band-aids on them, or we could work towards something better for everybody in the future.
No, I think that did answer it. And just to highlight a point too, generally speaking, the Patrick model is always more expensive and also less efficient.
Yeah. Anyone who's
Yeah,
owned an automobile knows that.
that's right. And maybe just to build up sort of what Pete says, I try to be optimistic as possible, and we see really good outcomes. So I'll give you one example. The city of Salem was facing PFAS remediation costs. They were facing lead service line costs. They're also a tidal community, so they get negative impacts into their sewer system. And just so Mayor Valor said, I need to bring in professionals. I want to sell the system. That community, which is, has a very industrial past, is as underserved today, has every reason to sort of feel like, hey, we've been left behind. Nobody's really going to help us, and be very negative about a referendum, right? We had a voting referendum. And to sort of what Pete said is that there are some groups out there that feel like they have to be negative about environmental, everything sort of negative. And, you know, my children teasingly refer to me as big water. You know, when I say something that's just what big water would say, Dad. But we went out and we told our story very grassroots to the people of Salem, said, this is what we gonna do what we say. We mean what we say. And we got 60% of the vote in a community that really had every reason to be super suspicious that a corporation could come in. We've broken ground on that PFAS. We've already done many fixes on their wastewater side in the first year there. We're going to have their remediation built. This is a community that relies heavily because they don't trust their tap on bottled water. A gallon of New Jersey American water is about a penny. A gallon of bottled water is somewhere between $1 and $10. It is, and not to mention what it does to the environment to create all this, right? Additional plastic. So we feel very optimistic, even though it's a daunting task, that if we have a measured conversation with people, we can be part of the solution. We're not the whole solution. There has to be things like what, you know, Pete's doing in New York, where groups are building, you know, planting more trees and sort of grassroots protecting the environment and helping the environment. There has to be thoughtful policy from the state. There has to be action by big municipalities, and then regulated utilities can also play a role in that. But we do see these types of things, you know, and to the point about the combined sewer outfalls, we help the city of Camden operate its wastewater system. We were able to install a regulator system, reline the manholes, and really have a massive impact on the flooding that happens by throttling back the Delaware River, frankly, when it created reverse pressure up into that system
Mm.
to push the waste up, you know, into, because that's the other side of the coin, right? You put a lot of bad stuff into in the river or the harbor, but also you can reverse flush a lot of bad stuff out into the streets where people have to, you know, live every day. And as Pete said, they oftentimes say, well, it's just life, you know, it's just, you know, but it can be dealt with, but it takes measured, thoughtful conversation, not sort of histrionics.
I like that point, and it brings up another thought that I had that historically we build major systems thinking possibly what 30-year life, 40-year, 50-year, but climate impacts are changing faster and faster almost every year.
Yeah.
So how do we try to build now for an uncertain future while also trying to remediate what might have been the best practices of the past?
Yeah, I'll date myself a little and go back to the Ed Sullivan show and the guy who showed up with the plates on the sticks. There are many days as a water utility you feel like that because there's a lot of money that has to be invested in basic recapitalization, as you said, just new pipes, relining pipes, removing lead service lines. And then you have these exotic things that get people's attention, like per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, you know, forever chemicals. And then 1,4-dioxane will follow on top of that. And then microplastics will follow on top of that. So it is, you know, it just really takes steady blocking and tackling. You have to be engaged to put the money, and it's not even, you know, it doesn't have to be, if you can consolidate and create economies of scale and things of that nature, you can do it fairly economically, but it takes wherewithal. People don't think about these things every day, or they just accept that it's always been this way, so it's always got to be this way. But it is really a steady investment into our infrastructure. And you know, and of course, I guess rightly so, all with AI and electric consumption around data centers, right? That just sucks all the oxygen out of the room, almost quite literally, to when you get around issues of water that we want to talk about, yet we're so fundamental, right? As Pete said, the harbor's the biggest open space in New York, yet it's sort of this industrial afterthought to many people that it's just there to, you know, facilitate stuff that's happening on land.
Well, thank you for that, Mark, because you also kind of teased the next major topic that I want to talk about. But before we get to that, actually, Pete, you have any thoughts on what Mark just said?
Yeah, I think that I mean, and to your question, like um, in the grand scheme of things, 40 to 50 years is it's so hard for even planning 40 to 50 years ahead for any election cycle. It's so hard for um, people with decision-making power to invest in something that's 40 to 50 years away. But that's really just again a band-aid. If this one threats could be coming harder and faster, but also what happens in 40 to 50 years? We just have to do the same thing again. So I think that we haven't solved that problem, but it would be great if we could be planning a lot further ahead than that. I mean, in the post Sandy reconstruction projects are ongoing in New York City, and that was 11 years ago. And there's still in New Orleans, there's still Katrina, projects that were initiated because of Hurricane Katrina that are still, have 20-year timelines ahead of them. So it takes a long time, and it's hard for all of us to understand and invest what's necessary to prepare for what's coming.
Yeah, and I think Mark brought up a good point before that it's not always the huge hurricane or like the massive storm, although unfortunately those are happening more and getting stronger faster and all of that. There's the cloudburst rain events that seem to happen all the damn time now, where you get a month of rain in like 10 hours, the small changes in temperature, changes in humidity. So I don't know, to me it feels like there's a lot piling up that over time is going to cost a lot more in capital and unfortunately human impacts than I think a lot of people currently understand.
Yeah, there's no question that I think we don't delve deep enough into the overall impact. And I have to say, as much as I tease my children about, making fun of me, um, they they're very engaged. This generation's amazingly engaged on issues. I'm constantly hearing from them, hey, have you heard about this issue or that issue? And they're very engaged in the environment. So I do think if they can sort of stick with it and slog through the challenges that it takes to get into seats of power and make decisions, they can have a huge impact. But we need to feed that and nurture that a lot better.
Absolutely agree. Um, we're starting to run up on time just a bit. I want to obviously leave time for the final question. But the final major topic I wanted to address and get you guys' opinion on artificial intelligence in data centers. I see a lot of promise, but then also a lot of questions and frankly worry from a lot of people on environmental impacts, energy use, and also water use. Have you given any thoughts to the topic and actually on the water impacts itself? Can AI or do you expect AI to have potentially a negative impact on your business going forward?
You want to take that, Mark?
Yeah, sure. Hold on, let me just Google the answer to that, see what AI tells me I should say. Yeah, so maybe I'll deal with it on a couple levels. One, we're paying a lot of attention to where data centers are going because with chillers and other things, there can be a tremendous impact on water usage and those types of things. So yes, we are trying to both as a business and an industry pay attention where they're going, but also as a business and an industry that has to think about the long-term impacts. Warehouses are the other things. Pete talked a lot about, green roofs and things like that. The first thing I think of as I go over the Walt Whitman Bridge and see the massive uh, warehouse they bought is how much water has just been taken out of the aquifers that I operate on the other side of the bridge and are going straight in the Delaware River now in an area where it's salty, so we're not taking water out of the river down there.
That makes sense.
So that's sort of one side of it. The other side of it is I get a lot of questions around AI. We think AI can be really helpful on predictive modeling and maintenance. Do I know this pump is going to break at this time? Or are there different indicators of We do a lot on acoustics, right? Non-revenue water, water that's lost. If we're able to be better about that, we can overcome some of those impacts, particularly of climate. But at the end of the day, we are a utility that people ingest. And we know that we need caring, living, empathetic human beings operating those systems. So while AI can help those folks leverage themselves up to be the best and do the best work they can do, we are a very human oriented uh, operation, and particularly in terms of the production of water and the attention to water. So that's sort of how I view, AI could be a tremendous tool to help us, force multiplier, as we like to say, from the military services group, um, but has its place. It has to sort of be in its place, and I have to have those human operators really caring about the people at the other end of that tap.
That all makes sense to me, but just as one quick follow-up before we get to Pete, do you have concerns over the potential, oh, not potential, over the large volume of water that each one of these data centers uses?
You know, I would say maybe writ large. I think as a company, we are keeping our eye on that, particularly out west where water constraints can be more severe. The thought I have is in New Jersey, we have ample amounts of water. It's just oftentimes the question of what the quality is and how much effort it takes to clean it to a place where it can be used. And in the military group, actually, we did some, breaking purple pipe sort of groundbreaking work on renewable and reuse, water reuse. And there could be an avenue for that, particularly around chilling and things like that. So there are answers, but yeah, 100% we're keeping an eye on it because it could become another big piece of the impact of this.
Interesting, interesting. Pete?
Yeah, I mean, so AI for us again, is a has a lot of potential to help us with our research and modeling of oyster populations, water quality, and all of that. I am personally, and I think Billion Oyster Project is to some degree a little old-fashioned when it comes to similar to what Mark is saying, that the analog, the empathy that's required to invest in nature is requires human involvement, human creativity, and actually getting your feet wet and your hands dirty and interacting with wild animals that exist in New York Harbor. And so I think there's really interesting potential. We don't think about it from a water use perspective because it's just a little outside of our box, but the so it's definitely something that's on our radar, has a lot of potential, but we stick with the analog a lot of the time.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay. I want to give you both an opportunity for some final thoughts too, but I always ask a variation of the same question to end each episode. Our largest demographic is young people, interested in potentially getting into these various industries and supporting water topics. Would you have anything you want to say directly to them? And in mind that to date, I think this podcast has been downloaded in 72 countries. So even though I'm filming in New Jersey, someone in Cambodia is going to hear this. So just toss that out there. And if you both want to take a couple minutes on that.
Well, I mean, well, the first thing I would say is that you have the power to affect positive change. You have the power to build a better planet, and the I think it's easy to underestimate the agency, your agency as young people in building the career that you want and the family that you want and the community that you want. And one, there's a lot of there's a lot of really interesting skilled trade opportunities for young people right now that are often not on people's radar. So there are really great and fulfilling careers in welding and construction and marine engineering, and there's just a lot of really cool jobs that aren't necessarily on folks' radar when you're going through the normal high school, college, whatever comes next. And so I just encourage young people to keep an open mind about the type of life they want to lead and impact they want to have, and not shy away from things that seem interesting.
Thank you for that, actually, Mark.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to most young people out there is that we exist, because they don't think about the water industry much at all. I joke all the time that there's not a lot of 14-year-olds laying in bed at night thinking, God, hope I get to work in a water plant someday, or even less saying, I hope I get to work in a wastewater plant. But I would say that if definitely to echo what Pete said, we have tremendous good trades jobs. We are a super stable industry. We've been around for more than 150 years. The Romans proved you can build a pretty big empire without electricity, but they didn't do much without water. And so water's been sort of, we genuinely sell civilization. So if you want to have a very impactful job, one that really actually, helps people every day, and you can sustain a lifestyle and a family and all that on it, please consider the water industry. Certainly in New Jersey and in American water overall, we have a program called Water Up. It's our water utility pipeline. It's an 11-week program. We're in Essex County right now, taking young people who've never thought about the idea. They're not traditional students, they're not going to college, and they can have a huge impact, and they can have a job, a great job. And the other thing I would say for young people is to think about the engagement of their regulated water utility in their lives. Go to their sink, open that tap, and then just think about that water may have traveled, 100 miles wheeled through pumps and wells and treatment plants to get to us. So we have one young person in particular that we're targeting for future employment because of her assertiveness.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think, I think we should talk to her.
Absolutely.
Oh, she's being shy now.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Everybody, this is Haley. She's being shy.
Hi,
But
Haley.
Haley, these are friends of Daddy's.
Hey, Haley.
They're good people.
All mine are bigger now, so they're at colleges or even out in the workforce.
Okay. Yeah, well, okay, well, here you go. And for the record, I'm definitely leaving this in, by the way. I I think this is a good spot to finish. Just as a final thought, the connection to water and public health has always been 100%, and the impacts of actually one on the other have been incontrovertible for as long as humans have been around. And the work that Pete and Mark are doing is critically important on these topics. And to echo what both of you said today, we all can have positive impacts and leave the world a better place, frankly, for people just like Haley. And I didn't intend that, but I'm going to use it. So I will go with that and say thank you guys very, very much for being here today. I enjoyed the chat, and thank you for everyone who's listening.
Thanks so much
Thanks
for
so
having
much.
us.